What is paganism? What is Wicca? Their belief systems, traditions, and rituals. Seen here, images representing stereotypes and historic caricatures of witches and pagans. Welcome to Exploring Paganism. In this program, we'll look at the history of paganism and Wicca, and examples of contemporary practice, including these examples of festive altars. Again, we hear from Lydia M.N. Crabtree, High Priestess and President of the Willow Dragonstone Community and Coven, as well as an author and pagan rights advocate. She divides the history into 3 periods.
So before the, what I call pre-Malleus Maleficorum, what happens is the Catholic Church starts to rise in power. And the way that it does this is by getting financial power and land power. And so they're consolidating these things. And then the big thing that happens is the Black Plague hits Europe. Now, the reason this is important is because one of the major theological debates in the Catholic Church is how can there be a benevolent God and bad things happen? And as they're having this discussion, then the Black Plague happens. And so the Catholic Church kind of needs a scapegoat, right? Like, they have to have some way to explain that a benevolent God is there and then there are bad things still happening. And one of the ways that this is addressed is by looking at the pagan people who aren't reading and then also looking at women, often gay men, people who had land, who had power that maybe the church wanted. And they really needed a mechanism by which to get rid of them. And so you begin to see what we call the beginning of the witch hunts. In 1450, you see the first of the major witch hunts began. Now notice this is pre-Malleus Maleficorum, before the witch's hammer. But it starts really by them trying to identify any deviant behavior or behavior that's a drain on society. So women who wore conical hats, and they were the wise women, and they would go around and peddle their, potions, often herbal. They became victims of this. Gay men became victims of this. Women who had land that had been left to them because their fathers and brothers have died become victims of this. So you see this kind of surgence happening. The other important thing that happens in 1450 is Johannes Gutenberg invents the movable press. And the first thing that he begins to publish and begins to be widely distributed is, of course, the Bible. And the second most printed material of that day quickly becomes the Malleus Maleficorum, the witch's hammer, which is released, as I said, in 1486-87. So now you have a bunch of people who can read, and the only 2 books they have available to them are the Bible and the Malleus Maleficorum. And the Malleus Maleficorum is simply a how-to to identify witches and burn them. And it asserts a lot of things that were not true then and are not true now. It asserts that witches cavort with Satan. Satan's the big bad now. Satan's why bad things happen. And if a bad thing's happening in a community, it's because some woman is cavorting with Satan by the silvery moon and doing nasty sex acts. And this is when you begin to see, and I've mentioned this before, a lot of the imagery we see at Halloween comes straight out of the Malleus Maleficorum, which, by the way, is in essence a torture manual. I have tried to read it several times. I can't get through it. It's that gruesome, what they suggest you do to determine. And most of the time it's torture till confession. So they're getting confessions of people saying, yes, I was, cavorting with the devil, but they've tortured it out of them. So it's not like you can rely on that to be okay. And this is what pagans began to refer to this period of time as the burning times, because there are estimates anywhere from 100,000 down to maybe 30,000 people are killed during these witch hunt trials, usually by fire, if they don't die in torture. And so this time period in Europe is really fraught with a lot of executions and trials, and it's backed originally by the church. And the other interesting thing is it's important to note most of these were not church. It wasn't a church judicial system. It was actually the judicial system of England or the country that they were in that were holding these trials. But they were holding it in with the approval and backing and pushing of the church. And they were using the church's manual, the Malleus Maleficorum, which is the witch's hammer, to do that. So in 1563, after the witch's hammer is published, you begin to see priests start speaking about the wrongness of what's happening. And slowly but surely, you begin to see witch panics happening that are not manufactured by the church. I think it's a really good example of you create hysteria, and then one day hysteria breaks out and you weren't there. And it's really because of all the work you've done before. And so they began to see some, in 1609, there's a big witch panic that happens in Basque. And the governing body there that was of the Inquisition steps in and says, this is a hoax, and issued an edict of silence, basically saying, don't speak of witches or we will arrest you for that. And amazingly enough, no one dies, and the panic goes away. So what they began to learn is, oh, well, we can quell some of this and maybe stop people we don't want to die, that don't have land and are just going to end up being scapegoats. And so that's kind of how this plays out over time. Then by 1792 and 1830, in that time period, you begin to see the last executions in the world, in Europe, and in South America.
Of witches.
Of witches. Now, the important thing to point out here is that in Africa and in some South American countries, witch hunts still happen. And they are driven largely by an evangelical base who, again, purports this idea that Satan is out there and luring boys or girls into possession to do things. And so you do still see just horrible stories of just random stonings of people for being a witch. So it still goes on today, but it is much less, and it's definitely not done in the guise of any government. It's often done in a mode of hysteria of a mass of people, when something bad happens in the community. And so the teaching of the evangelical Christian, again, is that Satan is the big bad and he's out there messing with everybody. And so it kind of gives a platform of, well, then that has to be real. And that's a shame. The modern era that I talk about in the history of the craft kind of begins in, I like to say, 1614, when the Rosicrucians, or the Order of the Rosy Cross, issues their Manifesto Blind. And then in 1646, you see the first English Mason Guild accepting non-stone mason, which is important because they really were masons. Like, they put down rock at one time. But we see in 1646 that there's something more going on there because they're inviting people who aren't masons to join. And then Freemasonry is introduced in America in 1658. And I call this the rise of the secret societies. And from 1658 to 1789, there's a whole bunch of very interesting history around secret societies and how they intersect with the French Revolution, how they intersect with the topple of the czars in Russia. All of those things have something to do with secret society. It's a really fascinating era of history. But the way it's important to pagans and Wiccans is that it sets up a world where Aleister Crowley is born into, and so is Gerald Gardner. They come in during the Bohemian movement when the spiritualism is a big deal, and they're bringing sarcophagus from Egypt to their parlor party and opening them, and they're having medium nights instead of playing cards. They're inviting mediums to bring in the dead, and all of this is happening during a time where Aleister Crowley and Gerald Gardner enter. They are both very interested in the occult. They're interested in these secret societies. They are part of the rising Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is established in 1888. And some of them are even part of the Theosophical Society, which is still around, that was established in 1875. And these two men begin a correspondence and are both part of the, I'm going to try this, Ordo Templi Orientis, ORDO-TEMPLI, ORIENTIS, Ordo Templi Orientis, or the OTO. And eventually, after Crowley dies, Gardner splits with the order. And then the next time we hear from him, he's claiming that he's been initiated by a closed group of a family coven in 1939. And then in 1949, Gardner starts propagating Wicca through fictional books first, and then later nonfiction works talking about Wicca and this alleged group that he's met. Now, there's a whole argument, and there's for and pros about whether or not that group existed, and if it did exist, what kind of group was it, and was it a coven, was it not? I'm not even going to get into it, but that is part of the history of how this comes about. Now, Europe continues with, some notable events. The publication of The White Goddess by Robert Graves is still something that many pagans will get back into. And then Doreen Valiente starts working with Gardner, and she writes some of our most propagated liturgy, the Charge of the Goddess being most notable. And Valiente and Gardner do eventually split, and that begins kind of, if you will, the kind of creation of Wicca and all the different branches of Wicca. In 1948, you see the publication of The White Goddess by Robert Graves, which still affects the myth and culture of paganism today. Gardner is propagating Wicca by 1949, and between 1949 and 1953, Doreen Valiente, who is the writer of our best liturgy and most well-known liturgy, the Charge of the Goddess, and many other types of our liturgy, splits with Gardner. He also has a split with a man named Alex Sanders. And then you begin to see these branching off, right? First, they were only Gardnerians, as they're called, and then you're seeing the Alexandrians from Alexander's, and then Doreen Valiente has her own group. And so as Wicca is beginning to split, you're beginning to see this thing. Now, what is fascinating to me is the turn Wicca takes when it comes to the U.S., and part of that turn is driven by the book Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert Heinlein. Now, Stranger in a Strange Land is about an alien who comes to Earth to study humans and connect with them, and in it he discusses something called the Church of All Worlds, and it's kind of mysticism meets humanistic psychology. And what happens in the U.S. is in 1962, after Stranger in a Strange Land has been published by Heinlein, which, by the way, even Heinlein said was a work of fiction, Oberon Zell Ravenheart establishes Church of All Worlds. Now, this is important because when he establishes the Church of All Worlds, he really was establishing not a Wiccan church, but its own thing. Interestingly enough, of the 7 initiate members of the Church of All Worlds, almost all of them end up being pagan in one way or another. Oberon Zell Ravenheart starts out as his legal name and then changes his name legally to Oberon Zell Ravenheart, and now runs one of the biggest websites for Wicca. So for the United States, our rooting is really based in the Heinlein book, and it's based in the Church of All Worlds and how the Church of All Worlds kind of propagated, and then married Wicca and paganism as it went on. You can't miss the fact that the Church of All Worlds is also associated with Green Egg Magazine. And a lot of our liturgy ends up first being published and seeing the light of day in Green Egg Magazine. So in the U.S., it's all of that is kind of tied together in our development in the States. And it's really different than how Europe kind of, without Heinlein, develops on its own. And it's not as influenced by Heinlein's ideology and theology and view of religion and man's place with God. So that's a very interesting take that happens in the U.S. The other big take that the U.S. takes is the rise of feminism. In 1972, The Susan B. Anthony Coven, which later becomes known as the Dianic tradition, is founded by Z. Budapest. And this is where feminism meets paganism in the US. And this is, of course, starts out in California and grows. And it's still a wide portion of paganism today. Women-only covens who get together to support the sacred feminine and support the agenda of women's issues and needs. In the US, the other big issue that happens is the Coven of the Goddess is formed and recognized as a church. So this is one of the first Wiccan church, pagan church, that's noted as such by the IRS, and this is in 1975. And then the other uniquely American thing would be paganism intersecting with activism. And this starts in 1979 when the Reclaiming Collective is founded by Starhawk. And they are looking at social justice advocacy. They're looking at world planetary issues and ecological issues. And they believe that their paganism is inherently tied to the need to be an activist and an advocate. And so those are really, for me, the very unique branches that kind of come out of the Americas that you really don't find as much in Europe because of the space and time. The other thing that America has had that I think is missing in Europe is the publication of Michelle Remembers, which is allegedly a Dr. Lawrence Prasder meets Michelle Smith, who remembers that she's been in this coven and they've killed people, and it was all about being in league with Satan, and it kind of makes the rise of the witch panic in the 1980s and 90s happen. Now later, of course, Dr. Prasder and Michelle Smith are forced to recant everything that was written as being fiction, but by then the damage had been done. So unfortunately, in the United States, we had this time period where this is being reinforced, this idea that pagans and witches are in league with Satan, which is not true at all. And so we kind of had a step backwards, I feel, in the 80s and 90s.
But what happened? I mean, were there attacks?
Sure, absolutely. There were people who were arrested on charges of people remembering things and spent time in jail for crimes they didn't commit. I mean, I remember distinctly when I was a child in Georgia, a daycare center got charged. They had this child who went home and said, they're making us worship Satan, and everybody believed the child. And I can remember that everybody in the daycare center was arrested. And first of all, let's remember, most of the time when people cry witch, the person they're crying witch to is not a witch, right? They're just not. They're somebody that somebody doesn't like. They're not a pagan in the least. Unfortunately, though, their persecution ends up reflecting badly for all other pagans because people assume what's being told is true. But I can remember that playing out. And when it was over, the people who had been accused had lost everything. Their lives had been ruined, even though they had been exonerated. So there was a lot of that, especially in the South in the 80s, and it was all driven from that particular book, unfortunately. And you can still find this online. I mean, it's really easy to find stuff online that purports that pagans and witches are in league with Satan and we do horrible things, but the fact of the matter is that's just not true. Most pagans are kind of indifferent to Christianity, Islam, or Judaism because that's not our path. It's, we have a firm belief that everybody has a right to worship, just like the UN says. The UN says that's a basic human right, the right of religious freedom. And so we have that same belief. We just want to have the right to worship. We're not wealthy people. We don't have an agenda. We just want to worship in peace. And we want everybody else to have that right too. We want to make that space for everybody. So I think that's what's sad the most. When I see somebody going, oh, it was, the witch, I'm like, oh, it's somebody you just didn't like. That's a witch. You have to kind of understand a few things that have happened during the history of the craft. So when we talk about pagans originally, let's say 30 years ago, we were talking about people who were of a pre-Christian bent and maybe in the early Christian stages and existed. They also were called heathens or of the heath. They were uneducated, they had lots of folklore and superstitions, and those kind of stayed around even after Christianity pronounced itself. So when archaeologists and anthropologists were talking about pagans originally, that's whom they were speaking of. Then in the early 1900s, a man named Gerald Gardner, who becomes known as the father of the craft, he becomes into prominence, and he alleges that he gets initiated by a coven of witches in England. And then he takes this information public, much to their disgust, the coven's disgust. And this is the beginning of the foundation of Wicca, which he called Wiccae, meaning of the wise, so the craft of the wise. And the problem with this assertion is that what Gerald Gardner sets forth in his Book of Shadows that's been analyzed is really a conglomeration of the OTO, which is Aleister Crowley. Some people know of him. Aleister Crowley and Gerald Gardner were friends. They exchanged informations, and Gardner was also a Mason. He kind of ran in the secret societies of his day, and when he comes out with Wicca that's lasted for hundreds of years in this little coven, it smacks a whole lot of Masonry and the OTO and these secret societies, and there's a real, parallel there between the two. So this sets up the long-term debate, which is if you are a new pagan, we used to call this neo-pagan, then are you really a pagan like the other pagans? And for me, the answer is no. There's no way. The Druids were killed. The only records we have of Druids is through the Catholic Church. And that's a very tainted lens to be reading through, right? They didn't see the Celts as sophisticated or as well-learned as themselves. And so it's not really, you have to kind of read what they say with a grain of salt. The Romans who conquered the Celts in the beginning say horrible things about the barbarians, right? So you can't reproduce something that we don't have any record of. Now, in some other places, this is a little easier, but not specifically not the Celts. It's very difficult. The Norse, it's a little easier, especially the Greeks and Romans who left all kinds of writings and information. So we have a lot more information about them. But at one time, the resurgence of paganism in the modern era comes strictly from Wicca. And Wicca has a structure, a ritual structure that reflects Masonry and OTO and the Rosicrucians, kind of this hodgepodge of all those things put together. And now most pagans will know this ritual format, and not all will apply this ritual format, if that makes sense. So there's some shuffling around. Some people abandon it altogether. It just kind of depends. And this is when you see the rise of pagan in the modern era, because we start out all kind of as Wicca, and then as we develop as a religion, because we are a religion, so it's a new religion, starts around 1947. And so from 1947 to now, you've seen this really kind of condensed growth that you've never seen in a religion before, and a lot of that I attribute to the internet. Because when Christianity got started, they had to walk 100 miles to tell somebody new, right? Wicca gets started, and very quickly we move into a technological age where we can all start sharing information. And this causes, I think, Wicca as a religion to develop very, very quickly. So there are people who go, I don't want to do this ritual thing, but I go to the House of Trees. I go worship in the trees, and so I'm a pagan because that's what I do. I don't adhere to the Christian God, so I'm a pagan because I don't do that. So you get this more broader term, which is why Willow kind of describes it as any spiritual path that is not Islam, Judaism, or Christianity, and can have some of the former, meaning we do have people who maybe venerate saints from the Catholic spiritual path. So you kind of get a hodgepodge of mixture, and that's how you end up with paganism. And I would say to progressives, the argument between pagan and witch and Wicca is irrelevant. Like, we could care less. However, there's some very passionate views about that in the pagan community. And it's one of the little, you know how religions get into little arguments about these things. And this is one of the things that pagans themselves will sit around and debate. Well, I'm not a Wiccan, I'm a witch. I'm not a witch, I'm a pagan. Really, they're all, you know, I like to jokingly say, you're not Wiccan until you have to fight for your rights in the court. And then all of a sudden, we're all Wiccan. Check that out, because that is what all of our rights are fought under, is the fact that Wicca has been identified as a religion that is accepted by the federal government. So I always laugh about that. Like, okay, well, let me know when you have to go fight for your rights, and then we'll decide what you really are. The battle to place Wiccan and pagan symbols on tombstones of soldiers who have died fighting for the United States. And Lady Liberty League is led by Selena Fox, and they secure this victory in 2007. I'm sorry. In 1992, the first pagan minister is recognized in the U.S. So those are the two big ones. There are lots of little fights that happen all the time about child custody, whether or not Wicca is a cult and you shouldn't allow your children to be exposed to it. There's the biggest fight we have right now has to do with pagan chaplaincy in the armed services. So I'm going to guesstimate here from my memory, but I do believe that there's only 500 Islamic soldiers and over 700 Islamic chaplains. And then in the U.S. Armed services, there's something like a guesstimated of 4,000 to 7,000 pagan soldiers who identify as pagan. And then there are no pagan chaplains at all. Now, part of this has to do with the fact that paganism and Wicca as a religion is new, and we don't have seminaries yet. Like, we're that new, right? It's not a function of, it's a function of not having enough time to develop that infrastructure. That's part of it, right? And then part of it is just a lack of willingness on the government's part to admit that's an issue. Another big legal battle that's been fought is to bring paganism into prisons. Some of Selena Fox's work has been around this as well, learning what you have to do to be able to go in and minister as a pagan minister to people in prison who identify as pagan.